It's just after 7:30. It looks like we've got quite a group of people here tonight, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Mitch Matlow. I'm a fire captain. I'm a fire and EMS educator, fire inspector, and a public information officer at multiple levels throughout the state. Tonight we're going to be talking about fire safety in your home, some of the stuff inside your home, some stuff around the outside of your home, and then we'll talk about wildland. We will be discussing fire safety and some hazards, fire alarms and smoke alarms and smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors, fire extinguishers. We'll touch on some holiday safety stuff, although we will be doing another holiday presentation later in the year. We're going to talk about some wildland fire safety stuff. And then we're going to bring the wildland principles into the suburban setting where most of you probably live, and we'll try to guide you through application of those principles to make your own home and neighborhood safer. The first thing we're going to talk about is going to be exit drills in the home. The most important thing is for you to have multiple pathways out of your home, at least 2 ways out of every room. Sometimes that's going to be a window, but you need to plan your route. You actually should draw a floor plan of your home, plan it out, the 2 exits from every room, and then you should designate a safe meeting place. About 5 years ago, while I was at work, my daughter called me and said there was a problem with the oven and it was overheating. I asked her if she knew how to turn off the electricity. She was too young, she didn't know how to. So I started heading towards the house. A few minutes later, she called me back and said, "There's smoke." So I started the guys from my own department heading towards my house. I turned my lights and sirens on and I headed towards my house. And when I got there, there was my daughter with the 2 dogs standing right at our safe meeting place. The stuff really works. Even children can do it. The important thing is you have to practice. Practice is essential for exit drills from the home. And you got to make sure your exits aren't blocked. So here's a question for you. How long do you think the resident was trapped inside the house with this? Let me see your answers in the chat. DT, I like your answer. Too long, that's a good one. This resident was actually in there for days, according to the internet article that we got this picture from. That's not a good thing to have happen. All right, next thing, we're going to talk about things that can cause fires and things that can get lit on fire and how we need to keep them separated. Water heaters are one of the biggest culprits in the residence these days. It usually sits in the garage or it's in a closet in the hallway of your house. It's got lots of heat and it's in a very convenient place to store stuff. Or this person was using the overflow and overpressure pipe to hang their coat hangers. They've got their dirty laundry piled up next to it, which says to me there's probably a washing machine close by, which means they probably have a lot of dryer lint. They've got plastic buckets. That's not a good thing. Candles are another thing that cause fires a lot of times, and the candles don't need to touch what they light on fire. If you see here, we've got 2 candles next to a stack of paper napkins. The flames from the candles are nowhere near the napkins, and yet they lit on fire. Another question for you to put into your chat. What do you think the 5 most common causes of fires in residents in the United States are? I'm not seeing any answers. Sleeping while smoking, cigarettes, candles, those are all good answers. Candles left burning, Christmas trees, stoves, stovetop. Okay, let's take a look. Let's see what the National Fire Protection Association says. Cooking. Yep, the stovetop is a good one. Jonathan, that's a good answer. Smoking. Let's see who had smoking. We had DT and Jonathan. Good job. Heaters. Did anybody have heaters? I don't remember seeing heaters up there. Nope, no heaters. Electrical problems. Electrical problems are one of the most common things that as an inspector, I tell people, you can't do it that way. And finally, the last one was candles. The fire that you're looking at on that screen, by the way, excuse me, that was caused by candles in a Christmas tree. Excuse me, sometimes electrical problems are hidden. This one was up above the ceiling space. You're not supposed to stack junction boxes like that. There's not supposed to be open wires. They're supposed to be in a junction box and connected. Conduits are not supposed to be cracked. All of that would need to be replaced for this to be a safe electrical system. The fire codes and the building codes are there for your protection. Permits simply create the situation to get a professional inspector out there to inspect the work to make sure that your home will be safe. These are a couple of photographs of the most common type of electrical problem there is. They're not hidden. They're right out there in plain sight. The overuse of what are called multi-taps, where you got multiple wires going into a single outlet. What the code says is they're supposed to have overcurrent protection. In other words, if you draw too much electricity through them, they're supposed to shut off. But you can see from the picture on the right, not all of them do, and that causes a lot of fires. So if you've got any of the multi-taps that don't have a circuit breaker on them, cut the cords when they're unplugged and throw them in the garbage. And then we've got our friends, the mice. They like to chew on wires, and that's probably not a good thing. Wires might taste good to the mouse, but a cooked mouse in your attic probably isn't a good way to run your day. Any questions about those hazards? Seeing none, we're going to move on now to carbon monoxide alarms, smoke alarms, and fire extinguishers. Let's talk about smoke alarms. What the code says.
How can we tell how much is too much on a multi-use?
Let me back up. How can we tell how much is too much on a multi-use? Well, any multi-tap adapter that doesn't have a circuit breaker on it should be thrown away. The circuit breaker will look like a button that you can push to turn off the device, and when it overcurrents, it shuts itself off. And it will say that on the description. If you look at the left picture, there's just a rubber block that allows you to plug a bunch of electrical wires into that. Those are actually a violation of the code because there's no way to put overcurrent protection in them. One that's got overcurrent protection is going to have a circuit breaker built into it. How much is too much? If you've got a multi-use that doesn't have a circuit breaker, any use is too much. Okay, moving on to smoke alarms. The right way to do it is one in every bedroom, one in the hallway between the bedrooms, at least one on every level. You can put one in your garage if you'd like to. It's not required, but you do not want to put one in your kitchen. The reason for that is because in kitchens, there's a lot of steam. Sometimes there's a little bit of smoke, and we don't want false alarms. We want people paying attention to smoke alarms. So where on the wall or the ceiling do they go? Well, let me back up a minute. Let's talk about how they work, because there are two different kinds of smoke alarms. The photoelectric has a light beam and a receiver, just like the safety device on your garage door or on some grocery store doors, where you break the beam of light and it opens the door for you. In the case of a smoke alarm, when you break the beam of light and it scatters sideways to the center, to the sensor, that sets off the alarm. Smoke particles will do that, but also steam particles will do that. So steam and photoelectric alarms are a problem. You don't want to put them in the bathroom or near the bathroom because they will false alarm. The other type is ionizing. There's actually a small piece of radioactive material inside there. Don't worry, it's not enough to cause you a problem. And a detector to detect the ionized particles. When smoke goes in there, it gets ionized by the nuclear source, and the detectors detect the ionization. The good news, steam won't get ionized. So if you've got steam going into an ionizing detector, it will not set it off and give you a false alarm. Now we can talk about where to put them. They do belong on the ceiling. Putting them on the wall is acceptable, but if you look where the wall and the ceiling meet, there's a space there. This graphic says 4 inches. This came from First Alert. That's one of the alarm companies. When I learned it as an inspector, I learned it as 6 inches from the wall or from the ceiling. You don't want to use that space. And you want to make sure that you don't set your alarm any lower than 12 inches because you want it to get that smoke as it rises to the ceiling. The reason you don't want it right in the corners because that's a dead space. The smoke will never get to that corner. If your ceiling is sloped, you should put it at the highest portion of the sloped ceiling if you can get there. A lot of times, though, those sloped ceilings are too tall. Get it where you can safely get it, or hire a contractor to come in and put it at the right place. One thing that we didn't put in here is that a modern smoke alarm should have a 10-year battery in it. The old days of having to replace your batteries every 6 months when you change your time doesn't happen anymore. If you're purchasing a new smoke alarm, look for the California Fire Marshal logo on it. If it's got the logo on it, it will not have a replaceable battery. It will be a 10-year battery. Carbon monoxide alarms, on the other hand, still have 9-volt batteries in them for the most part, unless they're combination alarms. If they're combination alarms, they still have to have that 10-year battery. Where do you put them? They're most important in areas where you have a source of carbon monoxide. However, carbon monoxide can be generated by things we don't normally expect in the home. So putting one in every bedroom, one in the hallway between the bedrooms, one on every level, and definitely one where your water heater and your furnace, your HVAC system would be good ideas. If you have a gas stove or a gas oven, one in your kitchen would also be good. Some jurisdictions only require if there's gas-powered appliances on that floor, so make sure you check with your local authority having jurisdiction. That's the way it's worded in the code, who's doing that. If your house is all electric, you certainly might have issues that are still causing carbon monoxide to be generated, so one on every level would not be a bad idea. Check with your local jurisdiction having authority, because that will be the answer for your home as to what's required. As far as what's a good idea, putting them in every bedroom, in the hallway, in the living room, in your basement, one in your garage, and mounting them according to the manufacturer's specifications is the best way to do it. So where do we get carbon monoxide? Carbon monoxide comes from unclean burning. If you have a gas stove, a gas oven, a gas water heater, a gas dryer, a gas furnace, your barbecue probably produces carbon monoxide. Your fireplace might produce carbon monoxide. It could also be generated by a smoldering fire hidden in your home someplace. So a carbon monoxide alarm might actually tell you when a fire is happening in your home. If you don't have an alarm and carbon monoxide starts to build up in your home, and it doesn't take very much, you're going to start getting headaches and nausea. You might get dizzy or breathless. And in severe cases, you'll collapse to the floor and lose consciousness and ultimately die. Like I said, it does not take much carbon monoxide to start feeling symptoms. So please pay attention to carbon monoxide alarms when they happen. And if they do happen, go outside where it's fresh air and call 911. Combination detectors, like we already talked about, do exist. And when you've got those combination alarms, you want to make sure that you follow the manufacturer's recommendations for where to put them. Generally speaking, that's going to be the same place as where a smoke alarm will go, because as I said, they're combination smoke and carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is actually slightly lighter than air, so it will end up going to the top of your rooms. And DT, with your sloped ceiling, it'll go all the way to the top of that as well. Any questions about alarms before we move on to extinguishers? Okay, moving on. We're going to talk about where to put them, how to test them, how to use them, and how to find out if I've got the right kind of extinguisher for my home. So let's talk about where to put them. One on every floor. If you have a really big house, what the code says is you shouldn't have to travel more than 75 feet to get to an extinguisher from any room in any place. And you shouldn't have to leave the floor you're on if you have a multi-story house. So if you have a 2-story house that has a walk-in basement, you must have at least 3 of them in order to be code compliant. You want them along the exit pathways, or in this case, the hallway, in the living room near the staircase. In the kitchen's a good idea as well, because you've got a stove there. As we discussed earlier, cooking is one of the most common ways to have a fire, but you don't want it sitting right above the stove or right above the oven, because you don't want to have to reach across the flames to get it. When you mount the extinguisher to the wall, think about, is this going to be a place where it's going to get blocked? Because if it is, if it's behind the door when the door is open, that's not a good space. You want to be able to get to it quickly. You don't want to put it too high or too low. Generally speaking, the top of the extinguisher should be between 3 and 5 feet off the ground. What kind of extinguisher do you want? Well, there are water extinguishers. There are metal extinguishers for putting out metal fires. There are grease extinguishers for putting out grease fires in kitchens. Those are called Class Ks. And generally speaking, that's not what you want around your home. If you look at the side panel of every extinguisher right above the UL listing, it's going to tell you what the classification of the extinguisher is. You want a combination extinguisher, one that has A's, B's, and C's on it. If you look at this one, it's rated as a 3A 40 BC. You don't need to know what those numbers mean. We can talk about that offline if you'd like to know, but that's not necessary. What you do need to know is for A's, you don't want it less than 2. And for the B's, you don't want it less than 10. So a 2A 10 BC is the smallest extinguisher you should have in your home. If you're going to put one in your car, a 1A 10 BC or a 1A 5 BC is what's commonly sold for vehicle extinguishers. How do you use them? First, you're going to pull the pin. You're going to point the nozzle at the base of the fire, wherever the base of the flames are. You'll squeeze the lever and sweep side to side. That's the PASS acronym. Pull the pin, aim at the base of the fire, squeeze the lever, sweep side to side. Any questions about extinguishers? Seeing none, we're going to move along. Like I said, we're going to talk about, Jonathan asked a question about rechargeable extinguishers. Let's back up for a second. Let's look at this photograph of the extinguisher. Jonathan, if you look at this carefully, you can see that the head of the extinguisher, where the nozzle joins and the gauge is and the handle is, that's all metallic. There are some that are plastic. Most extinguisher companies that recharge and inspect extinguishers won't touch them if it's plastic, just because as the plastic ages, it'll break as they take it apart to inspect it. If you have a metallic head on your extinguisher with a metal handle like this one, you can take it to an extinguisher company and annually they can inspect it, recharge it as necessary. Basically what happens is if there isn't a leak, the seals in it will dry out and eventually it will develop a leak. And the powder that's inside these is very similar to baking soda. And if it sits still for more than a year, it starts to cake up. When they do the annual inspection and the annual testing and all of that of extinguishers, literally what they do is they drain the gas out. It's just nitrogen. They break the clumped up powder apart. They put it in a machine that breaks it up into very fine pieces, so they reuse the same powder, and then they put the fresh powder back into it, charge it back up with nitrogen, and that's what they do for the annual servicing on it. If they need to, they will also replace the seals both in the valve and where the head joins the body of the extinguisher. Any more extinguisher questions? No, there are no home rechargeable extinguishers. Good question, Jen. What do you do with non-rechargeable fire extinguishers that are no longer usable? So after a year, you need to get them inspected. If you can't find an extinguisher company that will inspect them, you need to dispose of them as household hazardous waste. Most counties have their own household hazardous waste, and in most cases, it's free to dispose of stuff like that. So don't just put them in the garbage can. Don't set them on the side of the road. Call your local household hazardous waste disposal site and find out how to handle that. Any more questions? Okay, moving along. Holidays. We've got Halloween and then Thanksgiving and then Christmas coming up. One of the biggest problems in Thanksgiving is cooking. If you take a frozen turkey and deep fry it instead of a thawed turkey, this is what happens. And you can get 30-foot flame lengths off of a fryer. So you need to make sure that you have thawed your turkey completely and that you have lots of separation between your fryer and combustibles, at least 10 feet. Probably more is better. Christmas time, the Christmas tree is the biggest risk. Like I said, that picture we showed you earlier was from a Christmas tree that was too dry next to a candle that was too close. The candle fell over and caught the tree on fire. It burned up that house, the neighbor's house, and 4 apartments in the building next door before the fire department was able to stop it. If you're having a live tree, or I'm sorry, a fresh cut tree, make sure you water it daily so that this doesn't happen. That's what a dry Christmas tree looks like only seconds after being ignited. Finally, the 4th of July. In many jurisdictions, all fireworks are illegal. When they're not illegal, it's just the safe and sane ones, the ones that stay on the ground. Aerial fireworks anywhere in the state require a licensed pyrotechnician and a permit from the jurisdiction having authority. So if they're going up in the air and it's not being done for a professional show, it's illegal. And it's illegal because people get hurt and houses burn and stores burn. So stay away from fireworks. Any questions about the holidays? As I said earlier, we are going to be putting together a holiday fire safety presentation. It'll probably be shorter than this one, but we will be doing it towards the end of October. And we'd ask that all of you join us for that as well. Okay, seeing no questions, moving along. Let's go outside the home now to your yard and look at the risks that you might have and how you control your environment outside. First, we're going to go out into the wildland, and we'll see what we do out in the wildland. Grasses, trees, bushes for acres and acres and acres. The kinds of fires that start and burn for 1 million acres, which is what we're seeing now, are not unheard of. So we need to learn how to take care of our homes in the wildland. So what does that look like? The model is ready, set, go. The ready is creating a defensible space around your home. If you look at this picture closely, none of the trees actually touch the home. There is bare mineral dirt right up to the home. Vegetation on the ground doesn't start until it's well away from the home. And we'll get into the specific numbers there. And this is a brand new home. And you can see that it's fire hardened. The eaves don't stick out way far away from the building. It's got a metal roof, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. The second thing is set. You want to be ready to evacuate on a moment's notice, which means create an evacuation plan. Get yourself an emergency kit ready. Know what you're going to pack if it isn't already packed. And if you're in a warning area, you should already be packed and thinking about leaving. If you're in a mandatory evacuation zone, you should already be gone. And then you want to write down contact information. So if your phone battery dies, you still know how to contact people. Because in this day and age of digital equipment, we all depend on our phones. How many phone numbers do you actually have memorized? I know I don't. I know my son's, I know mine, and that's it. I don't even know my daughter's. So write it down. Pack it someplace where you're going to be able to find it. Recently, I had contact with somebody who got evacuated from her home. She knew she packed her medications up, but she didn't remember where she put them. We had to get her new medicines. And then go. Follow your evacuation plans. Jonathan, that's a really good question. I'll get to that in a second, but that's a great question about asking what do you pack in your emergency kits. Follow your evacuation plan, monitor the fire activity, bring your kit with you. Protective clothing. Now, we're not talking about the clothing that I wear as a firefighter. We're talking about wearing long sleeves, long pants. Don't wear synthetics. Cotton or wool are a good thing to wear. That way, if an ember falls on you as you're evacuating, you're not going to get burned. Don't wear flip-flops, wear closed-toed shoes. I say that because Lucy always wears open-toed shoes. Right, Lucy?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Moving along. Some people think that the best way to avoid wildland fires is to stop building in the wildland areas. And while I like to spend time in the wild, I like to hike, I like to camp, I like to swim in lakes, I like to scuba dive in lakes. The truth is, I wouldn't mind living in the wildland either. So the right answer is, if you're going to live in the wildland, you need to be prepared. So what is the wildland? What's a definition of the wildland? Are the vineyards wildland? Let's look. The U.S. National Park Service says any undeveloped wildland or vegetative fuels. That's what they call that. So the answer is it's undeveloped. The vineyards in Napa would be considered wildland because it's just vegetative fuels. Now, if we look at them, you don't usually see a whole bunch of dry brush there. It's usually very green, except in the winter when the leaves have fallen off the vines. So the likelihood is that we're not going to have a fire that actually does much damage in a vineyard. But it can happen. Green bushes can burn. What isn't the wildland? Fully urban areas like downtown Oakland, dense, highly developed suburbs like the area that I live in. My neighbor's house is 10 feet away from my house. But it's important to know wildland fire safety because so much of us are living in the WUI. So what is the WUI? That's a wildland urban interface environment. So let's talk about the wildland model and ready. We talked about defensible spaces and home fire hardening. Let's get into some details here. Zone 0 is from 0 to 5 feet away from your home. That's the area right up against the walls, and you shouldn't have anything combustible in that zone. Concrete, gravel, those are okay. You don't even want wood chips on the ground. You don't want that kind of mulch there. So a 5-foot walkway all the way around your house would be a great way to do that. But that's kind of difficult for some people to do because they want to have grass right up to the house. But if you can do that, if you can create that non-combustible in the first 5 feet, hardscape with no combustible mulches, remove all your dead or dying plants, cut branches back away from the house, plant only non-woody plants, that is low to the ground plants that you can keep trimmed. You don't want combustible items on or under your deck. You don't want firewood or lumber storage in that zone. And don't store your garbage there either. Put your garbage cans 5 feet away from your house, not right up against the house, because an ember falling into your garbage on a warm, hot, dry day could cause a new fire. When we're fighting wildfires, we use the same principle. Bulldozers are used to scrape down to bare mineral earth and get the fuels out of there in order to make it so that the fire can't spread there. Zone 1, it's the clean and green zone. You want to remove the dead plants and plant debris from the ground. Clean your roof and your rain gutters, especially if you have trees that are over your roof. You're going to have them filled with needles or leaves. You don't want any branches that reach over your roof or brush up against the building in any way, so trim your trees back. Keep your trees at least 10 feet from your chimney so you don't start your own fire. You want to keep 10 feet of separation from the crowns of your trees, which usually means about 25 feet from one trunk to the next. Create a space between your combustibles. So if you've got a lumber rack or a firewood storage area, you want to make sure that that's separate from your home so that if your lumber pile starts on fire, you don't have an issue with it causing a house fire. So that zone should look like a golf course. Everything's low cut to the ground and stays green all the time. And Jonathan, I just looked back at the questions and I realized I didn't answer your questions. What should go in your emergency kit? Well, what's that?
It's later.
No, I'm being told that it is later in this show. Don't worry, we will get to your question. I was going to say, though, that we do have an emergency kit packing checklist that we will be emailing out to everyone. Actually, I think we have 2 of them, right?
Yes.
We have 2 of them. Okay. And in zone 2, which is just a reduced fuel zone, you want to cut your grasses to 4 inches or less. Again, remove your fallen leaves, keep your lumber piles neat and clean. Create horizontal and vertical spaces between the grass and the shrubs. We call those in the fire service ladder fuels. You don't want to have ladder fuels at the base of trees that can cause fires. On a big fire, this is how we reduce the fuels in areas where we're not going to cut all the way to the ground. This is what's called a masticator. It's literally chewing up all the vegetation and dead debris, and then it goes a little deeper and actually buries those chips into the ground. Sometimes those chips are left on the surface. It still is better than having 5-foot tall brush at the base of a tree. Here's another way that fuels are reduced along fire lines, and that's actually to cut trees down. This machine is called a feller buncher because it can fell the trees or cut them down, and then it stacks them in a pile or a bunch. And again, this was to follow that same model where we have 10 feet of separation between the crowns of the trees or 25 feet between the trunks. And that was the direction that this feller buncher operator was given. He's taking down some of the smaller, less mature trees so that he can create that kind of separation and keep the forest alive and prevent the fire from coming through here. We don't just throw that wood away. Any of the usable material is picked up and stacked. And this is a machine called a skidder. He's stacking the lumber. And then once he's got it stacked, another machine will come along that's called a processor, and will actually trim all the branches off of it and cut it to lumber lengths so it can be used in a lumber mill. And this is that processor. If you watch, you'll see it cuts the log so it's got a clean end, strips the branches off of it until where he's going to cut it again. Then he cuts it to lumber length. Once the trunk is too small for use in lumber mills, he cuts it off. And he'll stack that piece someplace else where another machine can come in and chip it and put those chips back into the soil. So let's talk about how to trim your trees. If you live in the wildland area, 6-foot minimum clearance from the ground to the lowest hanging branch. Sometimes you want to go taller than that. If you've got a 50-foot tall pine tree and you take off the branches at the bottom 10 feet, that's not a problem. That's pretty easy to do on your own. You can use what's called a pole saw. They cost about $50 at the hardware store. And you take your time, one branch at a time, as high as you can comfortably reach with your 6-foot pole saw. You're probably going to be doing just fine. If you can't do it yourself, there are contractors that you can hire to do that. You also want to remove the brush from around the base of a tree. Those are the ladder fuels. Excuse me. If a fire starts in the grass and then it gets into the brush, and then it gets into the smaller trees or the lower hanging branches, it can run up into the crowns of the trees, and that's when you get million-acre fires happening, because it'll run the crowns of the trees and burn everything, at least at the top. But you can have a crown fire and it doesn't touch the fuels on the ground, so it doesn't mean that the fire can't burn back through there again. Shrubs, you want spacing between them. You want them 2 times their height separation. And again, if you look at the trees, you see that 10 feet of separation between their branches, or about 25 feet of separation between their trunks. And this is on flat ground, because fire travels better on a slope. It goes uphill much better than it goes downhill. As the slope increases, the distance between your bushes increases. So your bushes are going to be 4 times their height, not 2. And you want 20 feet of separation between your branches. And then on a very steep slope, you want 30 feet of separation and 6 times the height. Any questions on preparations for your grounds, creating your defensible spaces?
I have a question left over on extinguishers, but let's put in the Q&A.
I'm reading a question right now. Hang on one second. We've got a comment from Jen about being in the urban environment or the non-WUI area, how embers from fires can definitely go into those areas. That's a great comment, Jen. You're absolutely correct. And we will be discussing that when we get closer to the end of this presentation, because we're going to take these wildland principles and put them into the suburban neighborhood. And I've got a question from the other side right now.
Q&A, how often should you replace your extinguisher? Just wanted to Q&A and stuff.
Okay, question from the other side came in about how often should you replace your extinguisher. Every year it should be inspected and serviced, and every 10 years the cylinder itself, because it's a compressed gas cylinder, needs to have a hydrostatic test. For most people that becomes cost prohibitive because you can buy a replacement extinguisher for about the same price as a hydrostatic test will cost. So discuss that with your extinguisher company and see how much it's going to cost you to purchase a new one or to service the extinguisher you have. And I hope that answered the question. Now let's look at a modern home, freshly constructed, and look at the features that are built into it to keep it from being adversely affected by a wildland fire, or by fireworks for that matter, because if this house were put in an urban environment and fireworks landed on it, it would be less likely to catch fire, because embers and fireworks function exactly the same way. The roofs are all made out of non-combustible materials. The eaves, that is the part that extends past the wall, are cut short, or in this case with a flat roof, all you have is the flashing wrapping around. There aren't any eaves. The soffits are basically the underside of the eaves. And then we'll talk about vents and gutters and decks and windows. Let's move on and take a look at all this stuff. Lucy, being a realtor, has asked me to mention that all of this stuff is now required, not only by code when you build a new home, but you have to disclose it when you sell or buy a home. And so there are implications for your sale and your insurance if you're buying in the wildland environment. So pay attention to this stuff, because it may affect you when you buy that home out there. Roof surfaces. Roof surfaces on older homes were made out of wood. Typically that was cedar shakes, and they catch fire very easily after about a year. So we want non-combustible materials. You want to have flashings be intact and covering all of your roof penetrations, that is holes in your roof, so you don't get embers falling down into your attic. Question keeps coming up every time I do a lecture like this is, are retardant treated wood shingles or shakes safe? When they're first coming out of the factory and the retardant is fresh, maybe. After a year sitting in the sun, all the retardant's gone. So no, they're not safe, and you don't want to have them being put on your home. So if you're re-roofing, even in the urban or suburban environment, avoid wooden roofs. Go with a composite shake or a concrete or a steel roof. The roof has two functions. Number one, is the roof material non-combustible, and will it stop embers from starting a fire if it lands on the roof? And does the construction method prevent a fire that's on the surface from getting inside? That is, are all of your holes plugged? You don't want any openings. So here we've got a picture of eaves and soffits. If you look at the top picture, you can see that the eave extends way out away from the house. If you're in an older home like mine, and again, I'm in an urban environment, my eaves stick out about 18 inches from the house, and I have no soffits. You can see the underside of the roof and the roof joists when they come out into the eaves. If you look at the lower picture, there is no open space. The eaves end a short distance from the wall, and that's just to make it so rainwater can run down outside and not come down the inside of the wall. And you can see that it's closed off completely on both of these. That's the soffit, it closes off that space so you don't end up with embers being able to travel upward into your attic space. Here's a variety of different vents and eave configurations. The one on my house is most similar to the far left picture, and you can see that there are holes that allow for ventilation in the attic space. On the others, you can see that there are vents in the soffits, and you want venting there so you don't end up with high humidity days creating mold in your attic space. But anytime you do those vents, you want to make sure that you have metal mesh covering every opening, and the openings of that metal mesh should be 1/8 of an inch or less. Oh, there was a type of soffit vent that Lucy found while she was doing some research to help me find pictures for this presentation, where the manufacturer had a vent cover that actually closed itself up by exposure to fire. That's called intumescent. There are intumescent paints available that actually swell up and create an insulating barrier. They're very expensive, and we didn't want to recommend any manufacturers, but they are out there. There are some very high-tech vent covers out there. So if you're planning on redoing your home, do your research, make sure you make your home safe. Let's talk about a little bit more normal maintenance stuff. Even if you're not in a WUI, even if you're in an urban environment, you don't want your roof dirty, you don't want your gutters full, because you want your rain gutters to function properly when it does rain. And yes, it will rain again sometime, just not soon enough. You don't want your roof having a bunch of leaves or needles on it, because they'll sit there, they'll rot, they'll create rot in your roof, and then you'll have to replace your roof prematurely. So keep them clean. But what if you don't want to get up on your roof? Hire somebody. If it's not safe for you to be up there, make sure you hire somebody who can do it safely. But you want to get all of that stuff out of there. You can cover your gutters. Often that makes it simpler to get those needles out. But when those covers fail, it can create a very difficult situation. You have to get the covers out in order to clean them. So if you're going to use a cover, make sure that you use a good high quality cover for your rain gutters, and make sure you clean above and below the covers every time you clean your gutters. And those covers must be non-combustible. Don't buy the plastic ones, because if an ember lands on a plastic cover on a hot, dry day, you can start a plastic fire. And then and basically what ends up happening is the plastic melts and you get a flammable liquid fire in your rain gutter. We talked earlier about not storing your firewood close to your house. Under your deck is even worse. This person has a whole bunch of lumber stored underneath their deck. It's a very convenient place to store it because it's out of the rain and they can work. But if an ember lands in that, they're going to lose their home because the whole deck will be on fire. Remember, fire likes to go up. And if a pile of wood underneath your deck catches fire, you're going to lose your whole deck. You need more defensible space below your home than you do above your home because fire travels up. And fences that have to be within 5 feet of your structure in the wildland environment should be non-combustible. That's a chain link fence or a steel fence. You don't want to put a wooden fence up against your house in the wildland environment. Windows can allow fires to get into your home. And although broken windows give it the easiest way, you can have enough radiant heat coming through the window from flames outside the window to ignite stuff inside your house. So how do you deal with that? Dual paned or triple paned windows insulate your home so you don't lose warmth in the winter, you don't get heat in the summer, and it will help keep some of that heat outside your home in the event there is a fire close to it. Tempered glass is often required in windows. The only ones that don't have a requirement for tempered glass are ones that are way high up, like the upper windows in this picture, because the likelihood of somebody walking into that window isn't extreme. But if you're going to put it in for protecting your home, you want to make sure that at least the outer pane is a tempered glass. And then consider putting non-combustible screens and or non-combustible shutters outside the windows. Just the wire mesh from a screen can reflect enough of that radiant heat that it will keep your home from burning. Don't depend on your curtains to keep that heat out. It's not going to work. Sometimes we have to go to extreme measures to protect structures. If you look at this one, we scraped the ground around it so it's got a non-combustible right down to the ground. But this is a historic structure in an area where there was a great deal of fire threatening the area. So it was actually wrapped with what looks like a space blanket. And you probably don't want to do that to your home. But if you look at this one, it has a wooden roof, and that's because it's a historical structure, not because it's fire hardened. We don't want to end up having to wrap your home in aluminum foil. Question keeps coming up about how about installing sprinklers on your roof in case of fire? Well, it sounds like a good idea. It will help keep you from having an ember fire on your roof. However, oftentimes when a fire happens in the wildland environment, power gets lost very early on, and you won't have anything to power it. And you probably won't have enough water supply to keep it running long enough while you're evacuated from your house for a week. So think about those things. It might not be the best idea. Talk to the jurisdiction having authority over where your home is and find out what they recommend. Generally speaking, when we plumb a house to put sprinklers in, we've got several water tenders with 2,500 to 4,000 gallons in each truck sitting there supplying us with water, and we bring our own pumps with us. So we talked about ready. Any questions about the ready before we move on to set?
I have a question about fire extinguishers, if you want one.
We've got one more question that just came in about fire extinguishers. What's the question?
Living in an apartment building, how can you tell if the extinguisher has been serviced within a reasonable time period?
That's a great question.
And
So the
properly.
question is, if you live in an apartment building, how do you know that the extinguishers are there, and how do you know they're being serviced properly? Well, you can do exactly what the fire inspector does. someplace within 75 feet of the front door of your apartment, there has to be an extinguisher. Generally speaking, that's going to be in an extinguisher compartment or box or cabinet. And you have to be able to see the inspection tag while it's in its cabinet. If you look at it and the extinguisher is gone, or you can't read the tag, or the tag has a date that is more than a year old, talk to your management and say, hey, could you fix this? Because it needs to be done. It needs to be safe. The extinguisher doesn't know how to read the tag. It doesn't automatically fail after one day more than a year. So if it is slightly over, you can still try to use it. If it's more than 10 years, you can probably expect that it's not going to have any pressure in it. And then the last thing you want to do is look at the pressure gauge. If it's not in the green, then it needs to be serviced. And again, all of those things, the inspection tag and the gauge should be visible through the glass door of the compartment. I hope that answered your question. All right, moving on to set. Set is the part where we prepare for evacuation. And we were asked earlier about what are we going to put in an evacuation and how do we get out of there. So we want to first create a plan. If we have to evacuate, where are we going to go? How are we going to get there? What are we going to take with us? How do we contact friends and family so we know that, so that they know that we're safe? So let's talk about the 6 P's, the things you want to bring with you: people and pets, papers, phone numbers, and important documents, prescriptions, that's medications, your prescription eyeglasses. If you wear a hearing aid, that's a prescription item. Your vitamins or other supplements that you take on a regular basis. Pictures and irreplaceable memorabilia. Your personal computer, hard drive, and disks. So you have those memories, even if you can't bring your computer with you, maybe you can at least recover the data. And then your plastic, your credit cards, ATM cards, and cash. Remember that in the event of a disaster that creates a situation where you have to evacuate, you're probably not going to be able to use credit cards and ATM cards for everywhere where you're going because there may be no power. So cash on hand is also a good idea. Here's one of the evacuation checklists, and I don't remember who asked the question earlier about what's on there. I think it was Jonathan. Like I said, we will be sending this out to everybody who signed up for tonight's event. This one, if we have your email, we will be. I thought we had everybody's email, but make sure we have your email so that we can send this out to you. We actually found 2 different wildfire evacuation checklists. This one comes from a university extension from the California State University system, or I'm sorry, the University of California. And it was in part helped with the National Park Service and the National Forest Service. So it's a very thorough, extensive list. And we're not going to go through everything that's on this list, but it's a good checklist for you to have for your wildfire evacuation. And we will email it to you. And then go. When the time comes and an evacuation order happens in your home area, get out and stay out. How do you know? Well, every county in the state has some sort of warning system that you can opt into. And most places also use what's called a reverse 911 system. So every phone number in that area will get a phone call from the automated system. The more ways you have of finding out how or what the evacuation status is for your neighborhood, the better, because you might miss one. You're not standing by your wired phone in your living room, but you've got your cell phone in your pocket and it starts to blow up saying there's an evacuation order that's just come down for your neighborhood. Get out and stay out. You want to know where the fire is. You want to bring your emergency kit with you. What you don't want to do is you don't want to depend on the GPS system in your phone or in your car, because that may guide you right through where the fire is. If you are mobility challenged, you probably want to start the evacuation if a warning happens. Don't wait for an order because it takes longer. And oftentimes there will be evacuation gridlock. So you'll see orders happen long before the fire gets to your neighborhood. You'll wonder why. That's why, because the gridlock happens and it takes time to get people out of areas. Evacuations are a law enforcement function that's typically done by the sheriff's office in the county that you live in. So we won't go into much more detail on that. But remember, when the order comes, get out and stay out. And make sure you have 2 ways out of your neighborhood, especially if you're in a rural, secluded neighborhood. You want to know that you've got 2 ways out, and it's not through opening Bubba's cattle gate and driving down his dirt road, because sometimes Bubba's cattle gate will drive you right through burning fields, and that's not where you want to go. So let's talk about suburban homes now, and let's bring some of those principles into the suburbs and the urban environment. We were asked a question before the event started about how important it is, and it's very important. You want to keep trees pulled away from your home. You want to keep vegetation cut low. You want to keep combustibles out from under your deck, all of those same things, especially if you're in or near the WUI. If you look at a map of the Bay Area, here's a nice picture that shows the East Bay, because somebody we know works in the East Bay and does all of that. But there's been tragic fires in the wildland urban interface in Oakland. We all have heard of the Oakland Hills fire. I particularly was there. Okay, Jen is talking about Zone Haven. Yes, Zone Haven is being used by many counties. And what Zone Haven is it's a website. So when an evacuation warning or order occurs, you can go to the Zone Haven website and you'll be able to type in your address and find out exactly on the map whether you're inside a warning area, inside an evacuation order area, or find out that you're not in an order or a warning. So if Zone Haven is important, if your county is using it, it's one of those tools that you can use. I didn't mention it because not every county in the state is using it, but that's a great comment, Jen, thank you. So let's look at the picture on the right here. You can see the Grand Lake Theater, which is in an urban area of Oakland. And in the foreground, lots of trees. In the background, lots of trees. That's the area where the Oakland Hills fire occurred. And you got homes dotted in amongst that vegetation. But this is not in the wildland urban interface. This is in a suburb. It's in the neighborhood above Oakland.
City. It is Oakland.
It is still a suburban neighborhood. It's not a suburban city, but it is a suburban neighborhood. Picture on the left is the Oakland Hills after the tragic fire. And you can see that lots of trees were left standing because not all of the vegetation burns. There's some green grass there that didn't burn. And it takes us back to the principles we were talking about before. Keep it green, keep it short, keep it trimmed away from stuff, and your home might survive. If you don't maintain your property that way, it's going to create problems. We don't want to have happen what's happening in the right-hand picture, where your neighborhood is on fire and planes are flying over, dropping pink goo on the neighborhood to retard the spread of the fire. So in the suburbs, it's the same as wildland. The causes might be a little bit different. We were asked a question before the presentation started about the cause of fires being 90% caused by humans. I believe that came into us from Eve. So Eve, thank you for the question. I don't know the specific number, but a lot of them are caused by human intervention and human mistakes, human stupidity, human errors. The weekend picnicker hanging out in the dry field and smoking and flicking the cigarette into the tall grass or the pine needles. Your neighbor's tree hanging over your roof could be a problem. So you want to work cooperatively with your neighbors to make sure that you're making the entire neighborhood safe. And if you've got neighbors that are setting off fireworks, you want to try to encourage them to not do that. Let's save the fireworks shows for the professionals where they have to have 100 feet of safe zone for every inch of diameter of the firework. Yeah, that's the way my brain works. I have to learn the code and memorize it. Other hazards, the unsafe storage of batteries against a fence recently caused a 2-alarm fire in my jurisdiction. Hazardous materials not being properly stored, unskilled laborers doing construction work where they should have had a permit and a licensed contractor. So, like I said, work cooperatively with your neighbors so that everybody can have a safer neighborhood, not just your property. The fact that all of you are here tonight, spending your evening with us, says to us you're concerned, and you're the kind of person that will work cooperatively to help your neighbors make the whole neighborhood better. We have gotten questions about what do you do about that neighbor that won't cooperate? That's when you start having to talk to the jurisdiction having authority, but let's not go there. Let's just work cooperatively, find ways to work with our neighbors to make the whole neighborhood safe. We talked about a lot of this already. We already talked about this home in the wildland environment, but you could build the same home in the urban environment and it would be safer from fireworks and cigarettes and that sort of thing as well. And don't we all wish we could have homes that look like these? But if you look at the home on the right, it's got very little vegetation right up against it. As you get further and further away from the home, there's more vegetation and the trees are in the background. They're well separated from it. Same with the one on the left to a lesser extent. There's a little more vegetation there, but it's all green. It's trimmed short and you don't have a bunch of trees rubbing up against the house. There isn't a bunch of garbage or lumber or firewood stacked there. The surfaces are non-combustible. That's the way you want your home to be, even in the urban environment. So let's talk about fire behavior for a moment. Remember, we talked about fire likes to go uphill. And when you're buying a home or building a home in the wildland area, do you want to be at the top of the slope or the bottom of the slope? Or the middle of the slope? What do you think? I'm watching for answers and I'm not seeing any. Where do we want to put our house? At the top, the bottom, or the middle? DT says the bottom. Jen says the bottom.
Jonathan says the middle.
Jonathan says the middle. Matt says the bottom. Tina says the middle. Well, unfortunately, folks, if you said the middle or the top, you're wrong. You want to be at the bottom of the slope whenever possible for a fire safety perspective. Fire goes downhill very, very slowly unless it's being pushed. Somebody sent us a message saying so they get to watch their neighbor's house burn first. No, we want to put our home in an area where if fire is going to get to it, it's going to be slow and controlled and not running. I have personally seen fires move at 80 miles an hour on fires that I was working on. We don't want that happening and have it come running towards your house. So what makes fires move? Slope, aspect, and wind. And we'll talk about all three of those things as we go on. But you don't want to have your house at the top of a tree-covered slope. You don't want a deck over a shrubby hillside. And do you have two ways of getting out? If you look at this picture, it looks like there's probably only one driveway that goes off of this property. There might be a second one going to the top, but do you have two ways of getting away from your property in the event of a fire? That's really important stuff. So let's talk about what makes fire travel. It likes to go uphill faster than it goes downhill. It preheats the fuels, it dries the fuels, and it runs uphill very nicely. South-facing slope, that's the aspect stuff that I was talking about earlier. Aspect is what direction does it face. In the northern hemisphere, the southern facing aspect is the driest, warmest area and most likely to have fuels preheated and dried to the point where you can have critical fire behavior. So we don't want our new home at the top of a slope that faces to the south. That would be a bad place to put it. We probably also don't want to be in a chute canyon or a box canyon like either of these pictures. And the reason for that is because fuels on one side of the canyon will preheat the fuels on the other side of the canyon, dry them out, heat them up, and then you'll have fire on both sides of the canyon, and it'll run upslope, especially in the box canyon, very, very quickly. You'll have very erratic fire behavior, and it'll run up like a chimney. So don't put your home in a narrow canyon like either one of these pictures. Then there's some other things that the weather has. Lightning can certainly cause fires. When it's accompanied by heavy precipitation, that's not as much of a concern, but we get a lot of dry lightning around here these days. And last year, lightning caused several very large fires. The SCU complex, the CCU lightning complex, the August complex were all started by lightning. So lightning is something we need to worry about. Wind is probably the most important factor that the weather has in terms of fire behavior. Strong erratic winds can push fire in lots of directions at the same time. And we'll spend a few more minutes talking about wind in another slide here. But wind is probably the least advantageous thing to have happening. When it's a calm day, it's much easier to fight the fire. Lightning, as I said, starts fires. And the higher the humidity, the more moisture is in the fuel, the less likely it is to have an ignition. On some of the fires I've worked recently, we had 99% receptivity. In other words, 99% of the time, if an ember fell into the fuels, the fire behavior analysts were saying, we're going to have another fire. So we don't want that. We want to see more moisture on the ground. That's why green grass is safer than brown grass. This is a video that has been shot of a fire I worked recently, and you can see what's developing above this fire is called a pyrocumulus cloud. Cumulus clouds are the ones that we see that generate lightning. And if the fire has unstable air over it, is generating enough heat, you will actually get a very tall pyrocumulus cloud going over. When you have those tall clouds happening, as the air and hot gases rise up, they have to be replaced by something. So you get what's called inflow winds. Winds blow towards the center of the fire because that's where the hot gases are rising up. Then they go up 20, 30, 40,000 feet. On the last fire I was on, the tallest pyrocumulus we saw was 36,000 feet tall. And we actually measure them with radar. But a 36,000 foot tall cloud is going to have the gases cool off very quickly, and then they fall back down. As they're falling back down, they hit that surface and they go outward from the center of the fire. So you get outflow winds. Again, this situation creates very erratic wind behavior and can create very, very erratic fire behavior. That's how firefighters, and to a lesser extent, the people who live in those areas, can die from fires. So we want to keep our vegetation healthy, whether we're talking about out in the middle of a forest or in your backyard. You want to keep your trees healthy, and if they're not healthy, either heal them or take them out and put a new tree in. You want to keep them moist, keep them well watered, because it is getting hotter and drier. This is not the format or the forum for us to be discussing global weather changes, but what I can tell you is in my 40 years of emergency services work, it is hotter and drier now than it was when I started. So as I said, we're not going to have a conversation here about climate change. What we can say is that fires are getting bigger because fuel moistures are lower and we're getting more erratic fire behavior. There is talk about ways to prevent fires from occurring, even with what we expect is climate change. But I am not an expert on climate change. I'm an expert on fire behavior. And so I'm going to avoid answering that question, Jonathan, not because I don't want to have the conversation, but because I'm not the person to ask it of. I do appreciate the question. This is a picture I took last year at the SCU complex. This is the Lick Observatory and the burn scar. You'll often hear firefighters talking about burn scars and how we try to steer the fire that's happening today into the burn scar from the fire that happened yesterday. When we talk about burn scars, we're talking about the area that's already been burned once. If you look at this, you can see that there is still lots of unburned fuel here, and we could have another fire there, but the fuels have been thinned tremendously by the fire coming through the first time. And so using the burn scar to our advantage is a good thing when it comes to fighting fire. None of us want to see a burn scar, but if you go and look at Mount St. Helens, millions of trees actually got blown down and millions more got burned up. But that area now is far more lively than it was before the volcano exploded. So the ground will heal. You just have to be patient. The last thing we want to talk about here is human factors. When we have an evacuation order issued, it's because it's not safe for you to be there. If you look at this firefighter, and this was shot at night in a fire, so it's blurry, but you can see that this firefighter is wearing lots of protective clothing. He has a helmet on. That black bag at his bottom is actually a fire shelter. And we practice getting into our shelters in under a minute. So if we're overrun by fire, we have a safe way to hide until the fire goes past us. Unless you have all of this and the training and the experience, you probably don't belong there. We have hoses that can pump typically 35 to 60 gallons per minute when we're fighting a vegetation fire, but some of the hoses on my engine can pump 1,500 gallons per minute. A garden hose does between 10 and 20 gallons per minute. If we can't stop it with all of the hoses and pumps and water we have, your garden hose is not going to stop the fire. Wetting down your roof is going to evaporate very quickly, and your roof is not going to be saved by your garden hose. So if an evacuation order happens, get out and stay out. If we have people who didn't evacuate, our number one priority is human life. So we will pull resources off of the firefight in order to save lives. We don't want to do that. We want to fight the fire and get you back into your home intact in a safe way. So when the order comes, get out and stay out. You'll often hear people talk about values at risk. What does that mean? Well, the human life is the number one value. The second value at risk is structures, especially people's homes. If we have to choose between somebody's home and somebody's business, we're going to save their home first. Hopefully we won't have to make that choice. Hopefully they both have defensible spaces around them and we can save both of them at the same time. But we want to make sure that we have those values at risk protected. So you provide the defense and we'll provide the offense. That's what CAL FIRE is saying these days. I think we have another question.
A question came in about if you are supposed to evacuate, you're evacuating, but you have somebody with you and you can't find that person. What do you do? Do you
That's a
find them?
great question. So you're supposed to evacuate, you're trying to get out, and you can't find a missing family member. The best thing to do is notify the authorities, both the law enforcement agency and the fire agency that are in that area, and get out. Let us, with our protective gear, go in and try to find that person. But that was a great question. If you look at this, this is from a recent fire, and it shows all of the equipment and resources that are on that fire at the time this incident update came out. There were 291 fire engines, 174 water tenders. Those are trucks that just carry water and can pump it. Helicopters, there are a variety of different helicopters that we can use for putting either water or retardant on fires. Hand crews, bulldozers, Other people, that's usually the overhead people like me. I'm an information officer. I don't typically go out there and dig at the fire's base or put water on the fire, although I'm fully trained to do that. And I have done that when I've been assigned out as a public information officer. But total personnel on this fire, 4,319. Every single one of those people would rather be at home with their families than out there fighting a fire. But we do our jobs because we want to protect human life and those values at risk. It takes lots of different agencies to make one of these large fires go out. Here's, again, a set of logos from a variety of different groups that were fighting a fire together. And while it's true that in the past, different agencies had different opinions on how to fight a fire, when we come together now to fight a fire, all of us are working with the same rule book, the same tools, same equipment, and it really is one fire department when we get to one of these situations. And that brings me to a question that was asked before the presentation started. We did ask you to give us your questions. Let me find that question. Here it is. Chris sent us this question. Can we expect city fire departments to help, or will they be overwhelmed? There is no one fire department. Even CAL FIRE, the largest department in the state, needs assistance from time to time. We have in California the most robust mutual aid system of any state in the country when it comes to fire and rescue. I personally have been on fires all over the state, called as a mutual aid resource. And when we get thousands of people on one of these fires, it isn't just from inside California. They come from all over the country and sometimes from all over the world. I was on a fire once where we had firefighters from Israel and from Australia assisting us fighting those fires. So while it's true, your local fire department may get overwhelmed by a fire, we will be sending thousands of firefighters to it if needed in order to overcome the fire. That's the end of the presentation. We want to thank you all for listening. We're going to take advantage of this time now to let you ask questions, and let's have some conversation.
I have a question here.
We have a question coming in now.
So, Q&A. How can an average citizen contribute in case of a fire emergency?
Okay, how can an average citizen contribute in case of a fire or emergency? That is a great question. We often get lots of people saying, I want to volunteer, I want to donate. The truth is, unless you've already been trained and equipped, volunteering isn't going to help us on the fire line or in the base camp. The Red Cross is the agency you want to be talking to, because when they set up a shelter, they need people to man those shelters. And that's going to be something as simple as passing out blankets and pillows to people who have to evacuate, helping feed them, maybe cleaning the toilets, mopping the floors, things that we can all do. As far as donations, again, to the firefighters, we can't take those donations. We don't have a way to take them in, but the Red Cross has mechanisms set up when they set up shelters in order to accept donations. I can't speak to the specific rules, but you can contact your local Red Cross and they'll be able to help you. Jen just sent in a comment. She would suggest CERT training. That is a great idea, Jen. For the Kincaid fire, we used CERT members to man the information lines. We gave them talking points and information about the fire. And when we were getting 10,000 calls a week, it wasn't being answered by us. It was being answered by the CERT volunteers. And it was over 100 of them that we had from the counties that were involved. So absolutely, CERT training can help because it will be able to help you in your own neighborhood and help us in the event. And it looks like Jen just put out a link for Oakland CERT. Thank you, Jen. I appreciate that.
That may not go out to everyone, but we can forward that if people have submitted their email.
Yep. We will put out that link that Jen just sent us after we check it to make sure that it works properly. If we have your email address, again, we'll send you those 2 checklists. We'll send out that link. Does anybody else have any more questions? So while we're waiting for questions to come in through the computer, let's go over some of the questions that came in before we started. What are the best exterior house materials to sustain a fire for building in a remote location? That came from Diane. How many gallon tank to have on hand? We talked about it already, Diane. It's the non-combustible materials. As far as how many gallons of water to have on hand, that's a question for your jurisdiction having authority. It depends on the site and the ability to fill the tank. If you don't have a well and you have to truck all your water in, it's far more difficult to truck in 20,000 gallons than it is to truck in 2,000 gallons. Thea asked a question, how worried should someone like me, not up in the Oakland Hills, but south of 580 and Fruitvale, be about fire danger? Smoke danger naturally, but fire danger. So Thea, if you look at a satellite view of your home and look up into the hills from where your home is, if you see a path of vegetation that comes into your neighborhood that's unbroken, then you should be concerned. More likely, where your home is, you don't have an unbroken path from the wildland area, and so you more likely have to worry about unsafe behaviors on your property or your neighbor's property. And again, work cooperatively with your neighbors to produce a safe environment for all of you. Moving right along here. How much really needs to be cleared around the house? This is a question that came in from Mike. Being safe is one thing, but living in an open field or lot is another. So Mike, like we said, the first 5 feet around the house should always be non-combustible stuff. You shouldn't have wood chips on the ground out in the wildland environment. And if you think about how most urban houses and suburban houses are built, we typically have concrete walkways or flower beds all the way around our house, or gravel or something like that. So it's not a big stretch for that first 5 feet to be free of vegetation. When you get out beyond that, the closer it is to the house, keep it low, keep it green. And again, get away from the ladder fuels and don't have trees brushing up against your house. Tim and Louise ask a question about how concerned should one be about green vegetation within 20 feet of the house? If you follow the rules and don't have ladder fuels under your green vegetation, being a tree, then you don't have to be concerned. If it's kept 20 feet away from the house and it's a green bush that's only 3 feet tall, again, not something you need to concern yourself about. Got a question from Sue about living in an area where an HOA has high fire risk and no power to control the decisions of the board. My first recommendation is to talk to the board and try to work cooperatively with them because they are your neighbors. And again, what you want to do is, as a last resort, bring in the jurisdiction having authority because they will be able to enforce the law. But again, working cooperatively with people is far simpler.
There's a question about the Fruitvale below 580 area and a comment about fire danger from earthquake. I think 2 people have talked about.
Okay, so Fruitvale below 580. Below 580 is not as big a concern as above 580, for sure. And fire danger from earthquakes can be a concern for all of us, absolutely. If you've got one of the older homes that doesn't have an earthquake shut off on the gas, talk to PG&E and have them come out and install one. If you don't have that, at least please learn how to shut off your gas and learn how to shut off your electricity and keep the tools around that you need to do that. You need a wrench to shut off your gas.
There was that person asking about that neighborhood below 580 off of Fruitvale. You're looking at the parks.
Yeah, so we looked at a satellite view earlier of that area, and there is A lot of parkland below 580, there are some unbroken chains of vegetation, but they don't come down from the hills. They're blocked by 580. So again, it goes back to the same rules we were talking about before, 5 feet of no combustible material up against your house, and then reduce the fuels and keep them clean and neat and green. Don't have ladder fuels around and you'll be much safer. And we've got a question here from Tina. How long is it worth staying to water that lawn and building? If it's a mandatory evacuation, Tina, your garden hose isn't going to help you get out. If it's an evacuation warning, you should have your car already packed and your keys in your hand and think about getting out at that moment. And for sure, when the evacuation warning changes to an order, get out. But if your garden hose that does maybe 30 gallons per minute on a good day, can't keep up with our 30 to 60 to 1,000 gallon per minute hoses and pumps and water supply, it's not worth staying there. Leave that to us. And even with all the professionals we have, I've been on fires with 6,000 people assigned to them. Sometimes we can't stop the fire. With all the tools and equipment we have, we can't stop it. We can steer it sometimes, but it often goes where we don't want it to go, and firefighters do get hurt, firefighters die. We don't want to see more fires happen where citizens of those communities stay in place and they die. Any more questions?
I have 2 more.
2 more questions.
Marshall says, with an electrical fire, should I use a fire extinguisher? What should I do?
Okay, let's address Marshall's question. Electrical fires. If possible, you want to start fighting the fire with your dry chemical extinguisher. If you look at the A, B, and C, and we can put on a lecture on just extinguishers and it would take an hour. But the C is for charged electrical systems. So if you have that ABC extinguisher, it is safe to use on energized electrical lines. At the same time you're fighting a fire with an extinguisher, somebody wants to be shutting off the power, the electricity and the gas to the house, and somebody else is calling 911. If you have to use your extinguisher, somebody needs to be calling 911 at the same time. But it is safe to use a dry chemical extinguisher. It is not safe to use a water extinguisher or a wet chemical extinguisher because that can conduct the electricity back to you. Once you've secured the electricity to the house, then that fire becomes just ordinary combustibles. But while it's energized, you have to use an extinguisher that is set up for use on energized electrical systems.
Mike says, if my home is on fire and I'm trapped inside, what's my best bet to get through unhurt?
If I'm trapped inside my house and my house is on fire, what's my best bet? Well, Mike, if you have your cell phone with you, call 911 and tell us where you are. We'll come to you. When it comes to rescue, we will risk a lot to save a lot. When it comes to a home, we'll risk very little to save a little. If we don't know you're there and the home is engulfed with flames, sometimes we don't go inside because it's not worth it. But we will put firefighters at risk to rescue you in the event that we know you're there. So if you can use your cell phone, that's great. There are other things that we could talk about where we talk about breaking windows and breaking through walls and that sort of thing. But that's putting you through a fire academy where we teach firefighters to get out of buildings. So your best bet is to let somebody know that you're trapped there. 911 is the best answer. Any more questions over there?
I have one more.
One more question coming in.
Oh, golly. It's a twofer. What do I do in the event of a car fire, and how do I get someone trapped in a car on fire?
Okay. First question. What do I do about a car fire? Get everybody out of the car. Get as far away from the car as you can. And do it safely. Car fires are complex, especially in a modern car where we've got gasoline or diesel fuel. We have large batteries. We have gas cylinders that lift our tailgates and lift our hood. And we have airbags in the steering wheel, in the dashboard, in the pillars, sometimes up in the ceiling. And all of those can create complications in the event of a fire. If somebody is trapped in a car and the car is on fire, the likelihood is that you're not going to be able to get them out, but you can keep the fire away from them by using the fire extinguisher judiciously until we get there. And then we will get them out of the vehicle for you. So call 911 early so we can get there. Any more questions?
That's all I've got on this one.
I'm looking for more questions. Do we have any more questions from anybody? Did I miss anybody's questions? If I missed them, type me your questions again, please. Well, that looks like it. Everybody, I want to say thank you for joining us. It's been my pleasure to talk to you this evening, and I hope you'll make sure we have your email addresses so we can talk again in the future about holiday fire safety.